Girl killed in a forest by strangers returns with a prophecy from Jesus. The forest loomed like a silent cathedral, its trees rising like columns stretching high above, their leaves whispering secrets with the wind. Ellie had always felt a strange sense of calm here, a connection to the earth beneath her feet, to the world that seemed simpler, more honest than the rest of her life. She was young, only 12, but the woods were her sanctuary, the place where she could escape from everything, the chaos at school, the fights at home, the loneliness she sometimes felt. But today, something was different. The usual quiet of the forest was gone. There was a heavy stillness in the air, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ellie walked along the narrow trail, her boots crunching on the fallen leaves beneath her. The air had grown cooler as dusk began to settle in, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer, encroaching on the path. She tightened her jacket around her shoulders, feeling a chill run down her spine. She paused, looking up, sensing that she wasn't alone. For a moment, she thought she saw movement in the distance, a flicker of something between the trees, a flash of dark figures that blended into the shadows. It was probably just an animal, she told herself. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But as the moments passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Ellie wasn't one to be scared easily, but the sense of unease gnawed at her, growing stronger with each step. She glanced back down the path she'd come from, the distant light of the cabin barely visible through the trees. But she didn't turn back. The forest was her refuge. She wouldn't let fear control her. Her heart skipped a beat when she heard the faint rustle of footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate steps, matching the rhythm of her own. Ellie froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. The footsteps weren't hers. She was sure of it. "Hello," Ellie called, her voice trembling ever so slightly, more from curiosity than fear. She didn't want to be rude, but she didn't want anyone sneaking up on her either. She waited, straining her ears for any response. There was none. The wind picked up again, but it felt colder now, biting at her skin as if it carried something sinister on its breath. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches swaying and creaking, and the shadows seemed darker than they had before. Ellie felt a knot tighten in her stomach, an instinctual warning. She wasn't alone. The footsteps came again, closer this time. Ellie spun around, heart pounding, but all she saw was the empty path stretching behind her. No one was there. No figures, no signs of life, just the shadows and the fading light. She exhaled in relief, shaking her head, laughing at herself. She must have imagined it. She was fine. But then she heard the voice. Soft, guttural and cold. "You shouldn't be here." Ellie froze, her blood running cold. She hadn't heard the figure approach, but now, standing just beyond her sight, she could feel the presence. A figure hidden just out of reach in the forest's shadows. It was a man's voice, but not one that she recognized. "Who's there?" Ellie asked, her voice steadier than she felt. There was no answer at first. The figure didn't step out into the clearing. But the air grew thicker, the trees seeming to close in further, blocking out the fading light of the day. Ellie couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, gripped her like a vice. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a tree to her right. She only saw a flash, dark, tall, and imposing, and then another appeared from behind a tree on her left. They moved like shadows, silent and quick, surrounding her. Her breath caught in her throat. These weren't animals, they weren't lost hikers. These were men. Strangers. Their eyes gleamed with something predatory, cold, empty. She tried to take a step back, but her body was frozen, her feet unwilling to move, as if they were glued to the earth beneath her. Ellie tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. One of the men stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. His smile was twisted, sickly. The others behind him stood motionless, watching her with an unnerving calmness, like they knew exactly what was going to happen next. "No, please," Ellie's voice barely broke through the tension, barely a whisper against the cold, heavy air. But the men didn't respond. They just closed in, their shadows stretching like hands reaching out for her. The world around Ellie seemed to slow down, the sounds of the forest fading, the distant chirping of birds and rustling of leaves quieting into a hollow, oppressive silence. In those moments, her world shrank to nothing but the terror in her chest. She could feel the icy grip of fear clutching at her heart, tightening, choking the air from her lungs. The men were closer now, surrounding her, and there was no escape. The last thing Ellie heard before the darkness claimed her was a low, mocking laugh, and the cold whisper of the stranger's voice, his breath warm against her ear. "We'll make sure you never forget this." And then the world went black. The silence of the forest was deafening. Ellie's body felt like it was floating in an endless, dreamlike abyss. She was aware of the cold that gripped her skin, the numbness creeping through her limbs, but it wasn't the same cold she had felt in the woods moments before. No, this was deeper, as if her very soul had been drained, and the icy grip of the afterlife was holding her in place. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she thought she was still trapped in that same darkness. The shadows of the trees, the oppressive silence, they were all there, and yet they weren't. The world around her had changed, the air thick with a strange weight, as though it was pregnant with an unseen force. She was no longer in the forest. Instead, Ellie found herself standing in an open field, the ground beneath her soft and unnaturally still. The sky above her was pitch black, but there were no stars, no moon, just an endless void. It was as if time itself had stopped, and she was left in a space where the laws of reality didn't apply. Her breath quickened as she tried to understand where she was. The sensation of having just been suffocated lingered. She looked down at her hands. The blood that had once soaked her body in the woods, was gone. She was clean now. But the memory, the pain, the fear, it was still there, pulsing beneath her skin like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. "Where am I?" she whispered aloud. Ellie's feet carried her instinctively forward, though she had no real destination in mind. She simply moved, as if propelled by some force she couldn't explain. The weight of the air pressed against her, making each step feel more difficult, as if she were wading through invisible waters. Then she saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, something in the distance that caught her eye. A silhouette, a figure standing tall, waiting for her. The form seemed almost human, but it was obscured by the darkness, too distant to make out. Ellie's heart raced as she felt a pull toward it, like a magnet drawing her closer. The figure stepped forward, slowly but with purpose, and as it came closer, Ellie's breath caught in her throat. It was a woman. Her clothes were torn, her hair a wild tangle of black tendrils that seemed to move on their own, like they were alive. Her face was pale, her eyes vacant and distant, yet there was something familiar about her, something that made Ellie's chest tighten. "Who are you?" Ellie asked, the words spilling out before she could stop them. The woman didn't answer, but her lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. Her eyes bore into Ellie's soul, and for a moment, Ellie couldn't look away. "You know who I am?" The woman's voice was low, soft, and strangely comforting, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that Ellie could feel in her bones. It was like hearing a song you used to know but could never quite remember the words to. Familiar, but out of reach. Ellie took a step back, her legs trembling. "What's going on? Where are we? What happened to me?" The woman's smile faded slightly, and she tilted her head as if studying Ellie. Her eyes flickered with something else, something deeper, something darker. "You were chosen." The words came slowly, each one wrapped in meaning that Ellie couldn't fully comprehend. "You were taken. And now you are a part of it. Part of everything." The strange words echoed around her, reverberating in her mind like a distant bell tolling in the quiet. Ellie didn't understand. How could she? She had been murdered by strangers. She had been killed in the forest by those men, those shadows, and now she was here, in this place, with this woman who spoke in riddles. "Taken?" Ellie repeated. "What do you mean, taken? What's happening to me?" The woman's expression softened. "You died, but you didn't die the way you think. You were brought here for a reason. And that reason isn't just for you. It's for the world." Ellie's mind reeled. She tried to take a step back, but the ground beneath her feet felt like it was closing in, tightening around her, as if the earth was a living thing trying to consume her. What's that supposed to mean? What am I supposed to do now? Her voice was strained, desperate for answers that seemed just out of reach. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached out a hand toward Ellie, and the gesture was calm, almost maternal. But as she moved closer, Ellie noticed the shadows around the woman, creeping in, writhing beneath her feet, wrapping around her like tendrils of smoke. The woman's gaze never left Ellie, and as she got closer, Ellie could hear her breath, heavy, like it came from deep within her chest, as if she were struggling to speak. "Listen to me, child." The woman's voice had taken on an urgency now, an intensity that sent a chill running down Ellie's spine. "You were chosen because you are the bridge. You have seen what most cannot. And soon, you will carry a message. A prophecy. A message that must be heard." Ellie's heart began to race. What prophecy? What message? The truth about the end of days. The woman's eyes flickered, her pupils dilating as if something terrible were rising within her. "The moment is coming. It will begin with you. And you must speak the truth. You must warn them." Ellie took a step back, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. Warn who? What's going to happen? The woman's smile was gone now, replaced with an expression that looked almost like pity. "You'll see soon enough. But it's too late to turn back now. The prophecy is already in motion." Before Ellie could respond, the woman's form began to distort, flickering like a broken light, the shadows around her closing in, merging with the darkness around them. Ellie reached out to grab her, but her fingers passed through the woman's image like smoke. The woman's voice echoed in Ellie's mind, fading as the figure disappeared into the abyss. "You have been warned." Ellie stood frozen in the now empty space, her heart thundering in her chest. The woman, if she could even call her that, had vanished, leaving behind only an echo in the stillness of the air. The field around her seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness creeping toward her, its weight oppressive. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The words the woman had spoken reverberated in her mind, louder than anything else. "You must speak the truth. You must warn them." "Warn them?" Ellie repeated in her head. "Warn them about what?" Her legs shook, and she collapsed onto the cold, smooth ground beneath her, her breath coming in sharp, frantic bursts. The space around her had grown darker, the chill in the air now biting at her skin, seeping deep into her bones. The silence was maddening, an unnatural void that felt suffocating. But even in the silence, she could feel something dark, something looming. Ellie's thoughts raced, her head spinning as she tried to make sense of the conversation. The prophecy, the woman who had warned her of the end of days. Was it real? Was any of this real? Was she even alive? The place she found herself in didn't feel like life. The field was like a painting, a still image without life or movement. No birds, no wind, no sounds, just an empty space, with nothing to offer except an overwhelming sense of dread. The woman's words hung in the air like a death sentence. The end of days. The prophecy. The truth. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force herself awake. Maybe this was a nightmare. She had been knocked out, right? Maybe she was still in that forest, lying unconscious, waiting for someone to find her. Maybe this was all just her mind playing tricks on her. But no, when she opened her eyes again, the darkness was still there. It was real. She was here. And that feeling, the overwhelming pressure in her chest, wasn't something she could dismiss as a bad dream. With trembling hands, she pressed her palms to the cold earth, her fingers sinking into the ground. It was firm, solid, unyielding, but it was also unnatural. Nothing felt natural in this place. Nothing was right. She needed to know what was happening. She needed answers. Ellie slowly pushed herself to her feet, her body stiff from the sudden rush of panic. Her feet felt heavy, as though the ground was trying to pull her back down. With each step she took, it felt as though the air around her was getting thicker, heavier, as if the world itself was watching her every move. The darkness seemed to press in on her from all sides, closing in tighter with each step, suffocating her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her, just beyond the reach of her vision. Her chest tightened, and her hands began to tremble. The cold air was thick with the scent of decay, and she could feel it creeping up her spine like a ghost brushing against her skin. A presence, somewhere in the darkness, loomed, watching her every move. Ellie stopped in her tracks, her eyes darting around the vast emptiness. The air felt different now. It wasn't just heavy. It was charged, thick with an energy she couldn't describe. You cannot run from what is coming. Ellie's blood ran cold. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The voice came from behind her, deep, malevolent, filled with malice. It was a voice she didn't recognize, but one that sounded so familiar, so wrong. It echoed in her mind, vibrating through her skull as though it were coming from inside her head. Slowly Ellie turned, but there was no one there. Just the shadows, so deep and impenetrable that they seemed to pulse with life, stretching toward her like claws reaching out from the abyss. "Who's there?" Ellie called, her voice trembling. She was trying to sound confident, trying to convince herself that this was just another trick, another illusion. But the dread in her chest was unmistakable, and she could feel her fear eating away at her resolve. The silence answered her, thick and suffocating, only to be broken by the voice again. This time, it was closer, so close it seemed to press against her skin. "You've seen what you weren't meant to see. You've crossed the line, and now you belong to it." Ellie stumbled back, her heart racing. The voice was coming from everywhere now, surrounding her, wrapping around her thoughts, drowning out her own fear, her own doubts. It was everywhere. It was in her head. The shadows around her moved, and suddenly, the ground beneath her feet cracked open. A deep, hollow sound resonated, and the earth itself seemed to tremble. She felt it in her bones, a seismic pulse that rattled her from the inside out. The chasm that opened before her was vast, too vast to comprehend. It was a gaping wound in the world, a tear in the fabric of reality itself. She could see nothing beyond it but blackness, a darkness that was deep, empty, endless. The voice came again, cold, like the breath of death itself. "You belong here now, Ellie. You've been marked." A cold wind swept through the space, and Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Something was rising from the depths of the chasm. A shape, a figure. It was too dark to make out, but it loomed like a shadow, something vast, something ancient. Something that had been waiting for her. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees. The ground felt as though it were slipping from beneath her. She was falling, falling into the abyss that seemed to call to her. "You cannot escape what is coming." The voice rumbled again, the sound vibrating through her chest. She could feel the pull, the weight of the darkness drawing her in, dragging her toward it. There was no escape, no way out. She had crossed the line. She had seen what was never meant to be seen. And now she was bound to it. Ellie's head spun, the edges of her vision darkening as the shadows closed in. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The abyss was swallowing her whole, and the cold was overwhelming. And then, in the depths of the darkness, she heard it again. The voice, louder now, shaking the very ground beneath her. "The end is near, Ellie. The prophecy is unfolding. You are the key." The ground continued to tremble, and Ellie felt herself being pulled toward the chasm. The abyss reached for her, its darkness beckoning her, calling her to the depths. It was too much for her to bear. But she had no choice. She was already lost. Ellie felt like she was falling into the void. The ground beneath her seemed to give way, and the dark chasm in front of her stretched endlessly, swallowing up everything in its path. Her body trembled uncontrollably as she tried to fight it, but the shadows clawed at her, pulling her down further. Her limbs felt heavy, her chest tight, as though she couldn't breathe. The voice that had filled her mind with terrifying promises, seemed to echo all around her, surrounding her like a storm. "You are the key." The words rang in her ears, sharp and piercing. They weren't just words anymore. They were a sentence, a verdict, a fate she couldn't escape. She wanted to scream, to shout, to fight against it, but her voice felt distant, muffled, as if the very air was thickening, wrapping around her, stifling her breath. The abyss was closing in on her, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive, until it felt as if they were consuming her from the inside out. "No, I can't do this." Ellie thought desperately. She struggled to lift her head, but it felt like the weight of the darkness was crushing her. She could feel her knees giving way, her body collapsing toward the ground. The cold had seeped into her bones, and the chilling whispers, the voices, seemed to come from all directions now. You cannot hide. The voice was no longer just one. It was many, hundreds, thousands of voices, all murmuring in unison, reverberating through her skull. You belong to the darkness, Ellie. You belong to what waits beyond the veil. Her vision blurred, her body shaking uncontrollably. It felt as if she was floating, suspended between two worlds. Her body was no longer her own. Her mind, too, felt distant, like she wasn't in control of it anymore. The shadows around her seemed to pulse, flickering like flames. The whispers grew louder, a constant, insistent sound that filled her ears until they rang. The voice now spoke directly to her. It was clearer, sharper, almost commanding. Look upon the end of days, Ellie. See the truth of what is to come. Ellie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror as the darkness before her seemed to shift, revealing an image, a vision, so vivid, so horrifying, that it made her stomach churn. It was a scene of destruction, of chaos. Buildings crumbled to the ground. People screamed in terror, running for their lives, but there was nowhere to run. The sky above them was black with smoke, the air thick and choking. The earth shook violently, as if the very foundations of the world were breaking apart. Everywhere Ellie looked, there was fire, raging flames that consumed everything in their path. The world was dying, but it wasn't just destruction. It was something worse, something deeper. Ellie could see it now. The people, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies contorted in pain. Some were crying for help, others were lost in a daze, but they were all marked by something dark, something that had consumed them. This is what awaits. The voice from the abyss rumbled, the words thick with malice. This is the fate of those who ignore the truth. The prophecy cannot be undone. Ellie wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. The vision was overpowering, overwhelming her senses. It was as though the end of the world was right in front of her, and she was powerless to stop it. The suffering, the pain, it was everywhere. In the distance, Ellie saw a figure, someone she recognized. It was a man, walking slowly through the ruins, his steps deliberate, his face calm, almost serene. His eyes were closed, his expression serene, as if he was at peace amid the chaos. No! Ellie screamed inwardly, trying to reach him, trying to warn him. She recognized him now. It was her father. But why was he there? Why wasn't he fighting? Why wasn't he running like the others? The figure stopped, his head tilting slightly as if he heard her, as if he knew she was there. Ellie's heart raced as she reached for him, but the darkness around her only deepened. The shadows wrapped around her, pulling her back, pulling her away from him. She could see his lips move, but there was no sound. And then she saw it. Behind him, the shadows coiled in on themselves, forming something more solid, something more malevolent. A creature, its form indistinct at first, but growing clearer as it approached her father. The air turned colder, sharper, and Ellie could feel the presence of something ancient, something evil. The creature's eyes glowed like fire, and its claws stretched toward her father, who remained blissfully unaware. "Father!" Ellie cried, though no sound came. Her voice was lost in the void, drowned out by the surrounding darkness. The creature reached out, and with one swift motion, it struck. Her father fell to the ground with a sickening thud, his body twisted unnaturally, his face frozen in an expression of horror that Ellie would never forget. The creature's form dissolved into the shadows, and the scene began to fade, but the image of her father's lifeless body remained burned into Ellie's mind. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping each other in a maddening chorus. "You are the key, Ellie. You must accept your destiny. You must speak the truth. The end is near." Ellie gasped, her lungs burning as she struggled to breathe. She could feel the darkness closing in again, the weight of it pulling her deeper. It was as though the very air around her was alive with malice, choking the life out of her. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed to her knees. The images, her father, the destruction, the creature, faded, but the weight of them, the knowledge of what she had seen, stayed with her. She was still in that field, still trapped. The vision had come and gone, but the truth of it lingered. The prophecy had been set in motion, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The voice spoke again, this time softer, almost comforting. "It is already written. You cannot escape." Ellie's body trembled as the world around her seemed to swirl, the darkness closing in once more. She had seen the truth, and now it was too late. There was no escape from what was coming. No escape from the prophecy. The end was near, and Ellie was its messenger. Ellie's mind was in turmoil. She could still feel the weight of the dark presence around her, like a suffocating cloud, a shadow that refused to lift. The whispers were relentless now, pouring into her mind from all directions, their words repeating over and over like a broken record. "You are the key. You must speak the truth. The end is near." Her legs felt weak, her body trembling as though it was being pulled in every direction at once. She couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. The darkness pressed in closer with each passing second, the trees around her bending and swaying as if alive, reaching toward her with long, skeletal fingers. It was as if the very forest had turned against her, as if everything around her was conspiring to hold her in place. Ellie struggled to get to her feet, her breath shallow, her vision blurry. The field, the forest, the shadows, they all seemed to blend together, a swirling vortex that threatened to consume her. The truth of the prophecy, the vision she had seen, kept replaying in her mind over and over again. Her father, fallen, lifeless. The creature that had struck him down. The destruction, the chaos, the end. She had seen the beginning of the end, and now she knew there was no turning back. But she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to face it. She wasn't ready to bear the weight of the prophecy. How could she? She was just a child, a girl who had been ripped from her life, torn away from the warmth of her home, and cast into this nightmare. As she staggered through the field, Ellie felt the ground beneath her feet give way again. The earth trembled, and the sky above her seemed to twist, the dark clouds swirling violently. The wind picked up, a biting cold that sent chills through her entire body. The shadows lengthened, creeping closer, wrapping themselves around her like chains, pulling her back toward the chasm. She had no choice. She had no choice but to move forward. She could feel something else now, something beyond the voices, beyond the darkness. It was a presence, something that had always been there, watching her. She wasn't alone. She hadn't been alone since the moment she had died. "Ellie," the voice came again. Soft, deep, almost comforting, but filled with a darkness that made her skin crawl. She recognized it this time. An overwhelming sense of dread flooded her chest as she realized who it was. It was the same voice she had heard in the forest, the one that had whispered the prophecy in her mind. It wasn't just a random figure. It was someone, something more than that. She spun around, searching for the source, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was no one there. Just the shadows closing in, the darkness thickening like fog. The voice echoed in her mind again, louder now, insistent. "You cannot run from your fate, Ellie. You were chosen for this. It has always been you." Ellie's hands shook as she clutched her chest, trying to steady herself. The air was growing thick, suffocating, and every instinct in her screamed to flee, to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped in this place, trapped in this moment. The prophecy, the truth, had already been set in motion. She couldn't stop it. The forest seemed to come alive around her, the trees stretching unnaturally tall, their branches clawing at the sky. The shadows gathered, their shapes twisting, moving toward her. Ellie stepped back, her feet dragging through the earth, but the darkness closed in faster than she could retreat. She could feel the pressure against her chest, as though the very air was being sucked out of the world. "No!" Ellie cried, her voice rising in panic. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The weight of the prophecy was suffocating her, pushing her down, suffocating her in its unyielding grip. The voice responded, now more forceful than before. "You are the key, Ellie. The end of days is written, and you will see it through." Ellie's body trembled violently, her legs collapsing beneath her. She felt herself falling, her mind spinning as the world around her began to shift again. The darkness surrounded her, encasing her, pulling her deeper into its depths. Her breath came in frantic gasps, each inhale feeling colder, sharper. She was drowning in the weight of it, drowning in the realization that there was no escape. Her father's face, frozen in that final moment of agony, flashed before her eyes. The creature's claws, sinking into him, taking him away. The end of days, her fate, was tied to this moment, and there was no way out. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more intense, their words blending into one unrelenting message. You were chosen. You will carry the message. The prophecy is yours. The ground beneath her shifted again, and this time, she felt herself being pulled. Not into the earth, but up, rising, floating, as if something was lifting her from the depths of despair. The darkness loosened its grip, just enough for her to catch a breath. Ellie gasped, her eyes wide as she felt herself drawn upward, toward the heart of the forest. The shadows seemed to retreat, just for a moment. The wind died down and the air cleared. The oppressive feeling lifted, if only slightly. Ellie found herself standing in the center of a clearing, the trees surrounding her like silent sentinels. In the center of the clearing was a figure. A man, tall, his face glowing with an inner light. He stood still, waiting, watching her. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she recognized him. It was Jesus. His eyes met hers, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a balm to her battered soul. His presence was unlike anything she had ever felt. Peaceful, powerful, yet somehow gentle. He smiled, and it was a smile that reached deep into her, into the part of her that had been lost, the part of her that had been broken by the horrors she had witnessed. You've seen what's to come, Ellie, but you are not alone. You are never alone. The words were soft, but they carried a weight that shook her to the core. He reached out a hand toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. The message you carry is important. The world will listen. But you must be ready to face it. Ellie nodded, her body trembling with emotion. She didn't understand, but she knew that Jesus was here. Do not fear, child. The truth will set you free. And as his hand touched hers, she felt the darkness around her dissipate. Not completely, no, the prophecy was still unfolding. But for the first time, Ellie felt something else. A sliver of light in the darkness, a promise that even in the face of horror, she wasn't alone. The light from Jesus's touch seemed to expand, filling the clearing with a glow so pure, so radiant, that Ellie could feel it seeping into her bones. It was warmth, like sunlight after a storm, a peace she hadn't known in what felt like an eternity. The air felt lighter now, as though the weight of the world had lifted from her shoulders, even if just for a moment. The shadows that had surrounded her receded into the darkness, the oppressive coldness fading away. But the peace was fleeting. Ellie could still hear the whispers, the voices that had plagued her since her death, still echoing in her mind. The prophecy was there, hanging in the air like an invisible shroud. It couldn't be undone. She couldn't escape it. But Jesus's presence offered her something else, hope. The world is already beginning to change, Ellie. Jesus's voice was calm, but it carried a weight, a finality to it that made Ellie's heart race. The prophecy is unfolding. The time has come for you to fulfill your role. Ellie's breath hitched. The words hung heavy in the air, each one sinking into her like a stone. She had seen the visions. She had felt the pull of the prophecy. But the gravity of it all, the responsibility that now rested on her shoulders, was more than she had ever expected. But I don't know what to do. Ellie's voice was barely a whisper, full of uncertainty. She had never felt so small, so vulnerable. She had been chosen, but she didn't understand why. She didn't understand how she could carry a prophecy, how she could be the one to change the fate of the world. Jesus's eyes softened. He stepped closer, his presence a quiet storm of power and compassion. You have already seen the truth, Ellie. You know what is coming. You have witnessed the end. But you are not alone. I will guide you. The words were comforting, but they didn't erase the weight of what she had seen. She had seen the destruction, the pain. She had seen the twisted faces of those who had fallen to the darkness. Her father's lifeless body had haunted her vision. The end was coming. There was no escaping it now. Ellie took a shaky step forward, her mind racing. But how? How can I stop it? How can I change what's already been set in motion? Jesus looked at her, his expression steady, unwavering. You cannot stop what is coming. The prophecy is already set. The events will unfold. But you can change how it ends. You can give them the choice, Ellie. You can show them the way. Ellie's heart ached. She had been chosen, but she didn't feel ready. How could she possibly carry such a responsibility? How could she be the one to change the fate of the world? What if they don't listen? What if I fail? Ellie asked, her voice trembling. Jesus's gaze softened even more, his eyes filled with understanding. The truth will set them free, but not everyone will choose to accept it. That is the burden you carry. But you must be strong. You must be the light in the darkness. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. The light in the darkness. The words echoed in her mind. She was the key, the bridge between the world as it was and the world that could be. The truth had been given to her, and now, it was her responsibility to share it, to warn them. But who do I warn? Ellie asked, her voice filled with desperation. Who will listen to a girl like me? Jesus's smile was soft, knowing. Those who are meant to listen will hear. And those who choose to ignore it will be lost. Ellie swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking deep into her soul. It was true. She had seen the chaos, the destruction, and the suffering. But there was still a glimmer of hope. There was still a chance to reach them, to save those who could be saved. But deep down, Ellie knew that not everyone would survive. Not everyone would be able to change. The darkness was coming, and some would fall to it. Before she could respond, a sudden sound broke through the stillness of the clearing. A loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the forest. Ellie's heart skipped a beat, her senses going on high alert. She turned to look, her pulse quickening as she saw dark figures emerging from the trees. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but the malevolent energy radiating from them was palpable. They've come, Jesus said softly, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. The darkness always comes. But it is not too late to choose the light. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as the figures stepped forward, emerging from the shadows like creatures of the night. They were not human, but twisted, grotesque forms, their eyes glowing red with malice. The ground beneath Ellie's feet trembled as they approached, their presence sending waves of fear through her body. The dark figures surrounded her, and Ellie instinctively took a step back, her heart racing. She could feel the darkness closing in, but she wasn't ready to give in. She couldn't. The prophecy had already been set in motion, but she still had a choice. She still had a chance. Jesus stepped forward, his figure glowing with a radiant light. The figures recoiled as though the light burned them. But they did not retreat. They seemed determined, relentless. You cannot stop this? One of the figures spoke, its voice a cold hiss that sent a chill down Ellie's spine. The prophecy is already in motion. The end is near. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as the figure's words echoed in her mind. The end was near. The prophecy had begun. But she wasn't alone. And she wasn't ready to give up. She took a deep breath, standing tall, her heart steadying in her chest. I will not let you win. Her voice was strong, more confident than she had ever felt before. The light will always shine. And as she said the words, a powerful surge of energy erupted within her, a force she couldn't explain. The darkness shrank back, the figures hissing in pain as the light from Ellie's body pushed them away. But it wasn't over. The darkness wasn't gone. The prophecy was unfolding, and Ellie knew she had to act quickly. Time was running out. The air around Ellie felt charged, as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The dark figures recoiled from the light that poured from her, their twisted forms writhing in pain, their eyes burning with fury. But despite the brilliance of the light, they didn't retreat. Instead, they advanced, their steps slow but deliberate, like creatures of the night drawn to the warmth of the sun but unwilling to be consumed by it. Ellie stood her ground, feeling the weight of the prophecy pressing down on her shoulders. She had been marked. The message had been given to her, and now she had to carry it, no matter the cost. She could feel the truth deep in her bones, in every fiber of her being. The end of days was coming, and it was her responsibility to try and stop it. But these creatures, these harbingers of the darkness, weren't going to make it easy. One of the figures lunged toward her, its movements fast, its form a blur of shadow. Ellie's heart raced, but before she could react, Jesus stepped forward, his presence a beacon of light that blinded the figure, sending it stumbling back into the trees with a howl of pain. "You cannot stop what is coming," the figure hissed, its voice a low growl. "The prophecy is already written. You are too weak to change it." Ellie's breath caught in her throat as the figure's words sank in. It wasn't just an attack, it was a warning. The prophecy had already begun, and no matter how hard she fought, there was no way to stop it. The end was inevitable, but Ellie wasn't ready to give in. She wasn't going to accept this fate, not without a fight. The light within her surged again, brighter this time, more powerful, as if the very words of Jesus were fueling her resolve. "I will fight for them," Ellie whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the rushing of the wind. "I will fight for them all." The figures in the shadows seemed to grow more restless, sensing the strength in her words. But they didn't retreat. Instead, they surrounded her, closing in, their eyes glowing with hunger. "You are not the light. You are the darkness." The words were like a knife, sharp and cruel, aimed directly at Ellie's heart. "You are nothing but a vessel for the end." But Ellie refused to let their words sink in. She had seen the truth. The darkness wasn't just something outside her. It was inside everyone. And that was why the prophecy had to be fulfilled. Not just for her, but for everyone who would listen, who would change. "No," Ellie said, her voice growing stronger, her words more certain. "I won't let you win." With each word, the light around her grew brighter, pulsing with power, pushing the darkness back. The figures shrieked in agony, their forms flickering, unstable as the light consumed them, driving them away bit by bit. Ellie's eyes were fixed on the creatures, her heart pounding in her chest, but she could feel the pull of the prophecy growing stronger. This wasn't just about her. It was about the world. It was about everyone who had ever been touched by darkness. The figures faltered, but they didn't disappear. They continued to circle her, relentless, like wolves closing in on their prey. One of them lunged again, its claws reaching for her, but Jesus's light flared once more, sending the figure crashing to the ground. "You cannot run from your destiny, Ellie." The voice came again, more forceful this time, filled with venom. "The prophecy will come to pass, no matter what you do." Ellie's stomach twisted at the words. Was it true? Could she really change anything? She didn't know. All she knew was that she had to keep fighting. She had to try. She wasn't the key. She wasn't the one who had to make this decision. They were. The forest seemed to stretch and warp around her, the trees bending and swaying in the wind, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. The light that Jesus had given her was faltering, the strain of holding it back from the darkness becoming too much to bear. Her legs shook, her body trembling from the effort. "Ellie," Jesus's voice was soft now, calm, almost sad. "It is not your fault. The prophecy cannot be undone. But you can help them. You can show them the truth." Ellie wanted to argue, to tell him that she could do more, that she had to do more. But deep down she knew. She had known all along. The prophecy was not hers to change. She wasn't the one who could rewrite the future. She was simply a part of it, a messenger sent to warn them of what was to come. Her vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She wasn't ready. She wasn't strong enough. But she had to be. She had to be for them. "I will not be your vessel," Ellie whispered fiercely, more to herself than to the figures around her. "I will be the light." And with that, the light inside her surged, pushing back against the darkness with all the strength she could muster. The figures hissed and recoiled, their forms flickering as they struggled against the force that now pushed them away. But they wouldn't stop. They couldn't stop. Ellie wasn't ready to accept her fate. She wasn't ready to let them win. But as the light blazed brighter, she realized something else. The darkness, the prophecy, it wasn't just for her. It was for everyone. The air around Ellie seemed to crackle with electricity. Her body trembled from the weight of the light now pulsing from within her. It wasn't just a force she could control. It was something greater, something older, and it felt as if the very universe was resonating with it. The darkness recoiled, but it didn't retreat. It kept pushing, kept trying to wrap around her, to smother the light that fought to keep it at bay. Ellie was fighting for herself, for the world, for everyone who had ever felt the weight of the prophecy. But as the battle raged, a thought clawed at her mind. Was this really the fight? Her mind flickered back to the vision, the chaos, the destruction. The figures, the creatures that had circled her, were merely harbingers, tools in a much larger scheme. It wasn't just the dark figures she had to fight, it was the truth. The truth. She whispered the words to herself, her voice shaking. The truth is the prophecy. It's all a lie. The light within her flickered, and for the briefest of moments, the world stopped. Everything, the darkness, the figures, the oppressive air around her, paused, as though the universe itself had held its breath. She stood there, in the center of the void, her hands trembling at her sides. The warmth of the light in her chest felt colder now, distant. It was as though everything she had thought to be true was slipping away, unraveling in her grasp. The warmth, the hope, everything she had been fighting for, it all felt like it was slipping from her, like sand through her fingers. Then the voice came again, the voice she had heard in the darkness. But this time, it wasn't taunting her. It wasn't whispering in threats or promises. This time, it spoke with finality. You cannot escape. You never could. The words echoed through her mind like a bullet to the chest. Escape? Ellie didn't understand. Her body was frozen, her mind racing, but the more she thought about it, the more she understood. The prophecy, the end of days, it had never been something she could fight. The light? It was never meant to save her. The prophecy had been set in motion before she ever took her first breath. You were never the savior, the voice continued, cold, unrelenting. You were the warning. The end was already decided. Ellie's breath caught in her throat, the realization crashing over her like a wave. The prophecy had never been something she could change. It was always going to happen. There was no salvation, no escape from the inevitable. It was not just for her, but for everyone. For every soul who had ever hoped for something more, something better, something to lift them out of the darkness. She had been wrong all along. You, Ellie gasped, her voice cracking. No, this can't be. The world around her seemed to distort as the shadows pressed in once more, the light flickering and sputtering out like a dying flame. There was no victory here. There was no salvation for anyone, not for her, not for the world. The darkness that she had fought so hard against was not just a force, it was destiny. She was part of it. She was bound to it. It had always been this way. And as she felt herself sinking into the darkness, into the inevitable, she thought of one final thing. The darkness wasn't her enemy. It was her destiny.